Hi, all. I'm Abby Vandiver, and I'll be teaching this masterclass on writing your first draft. It seems kind of weird just talking to myself. I don't see any other faces. I don't know who's out there, but certainly if you have questions, type them into the chat. I'm sure some of you have gone to earlier master classes. I heard that they were good classes, well attended. So I hope you enjoy this one as well. I know it's late there. I'm in the good old US of A. So I'm sure there are people attending from all over, but it's about 4 o'clock in the afternoon for me. So if I have a little bit more energy than you do, and it's 9 o'clock there, you'll understand that. So all along, you don't have to wait till the end. I will give about 15 minutes at the end to ask questions, but all along, if you have any questions, if you want to share what you're writing now, that's usually what I ask. And I guess we can't do that now, but what you're writing, maybe why you're having a question about getting started, or anything I talk about, in this presentation, or any questions that you have that you thought of as you were writing your first draft, or your draft, whatever draft it was of your work in progress. So I'm just going to get started. I'm going to share my screen. This is a little bit like Zoom, so I'm kind of familiar with it, but if I make mistakes, please just give me a moment. I'm going to share my screen here. Okay, as I said, I'm Abby Vandiver. I also write as Abby Collette. Both of those names are pseudonyms. I chose to write in a pseudonym because I was writing about murder, and I used to be a lawyer, and I didn't know if I was going to go back to work or not. I started working when I was sick, and I was sick for about 4 years. So I wasn't sure what I was going to do, but I didn't think it was a good idea if I went into any kind of legal field and have used my name writing about murder. So I gave another name a try. And then when I got a contract with Penguin for my ice cream parlor mystery, they told me that they didn't want me to write any more books as Abby Vandiver. I could only do Abby Vandiver with them. So I decided to change my name, and that's how I became Abby Collette. As I said, I used to be a lawyer, and I used to be an economics professor. I got sick. I started writing, and I have now penned over 30 novels and short stories. I started out as a self-published author, so I am a hybrid author, being self-published and traditionally published. I'm a Wall Street Journal, USA Today, and internationally best-selling author. And so that's a little bit of my background. I didn't ever take any formal writing classes, and I just kind of learned it as I went along. I suggest that if you feel like you need help writing, take writing courses like you're doing now, or get in a writing community. That's the best way to learn, I think, to hone your craft. The local library where I live offers free classes to writers, and they have things like fiction writing, memoir writing, dialogue, writing authentic characters. And I suggest that you do those things. That's all a part of your manuscript. It won't be discussed today in my presentation, but just so you know, you have to have those things, and I mention them, list them later, in order to write the manuscript. Here we're just going to talk about your first draft and what you need to do in that first draft. So writing is hard. I'm sure if anyone here has ever written a book or tried to write a book, it's hard. I have talked to people who say they have been working on this book for 10 years and for 7 years, that they get kind of a writer's block. I don't really believe in writer block, because we're creatives. Something is always going on in our mind, but you get stuck. You don't know where the story is going or where it should go. You don't know what your characters should be doing, how to reach that climax in the story that you need to reach to draw your characters in, building up that tension and building up conflict. It's hard to do. It's not an easy thing to do. So you'll hear writers all the time, and maybe even yourself, obsessing on, how do I do this? How do I get my book written? How do I make it interesting? How do I make it engaging? How do I make it a page turner? Of course, as I said, those are classes that you certainly can take. That's not what this class is about, but that's all part of writing your manuscript, and that's what makes it hard. Getting started is very hard to do. You want to give that killer first line. So, you just go over that in your mind. You want to be able to draw your reader in with the first line or the first couple paragraphs or the first page. So all those things go into writing, and it is hard. I think that the things that we'll talk about today will make it a little easier. It'll make it easier to get started. It'll make it easier to get through that middle and get to the finish line. Because I think that one of the problems with getting finished is story progression. People have a hard time going from A to B to C, in your story. You don't know exactly the direction you should go or what the characters are doing. So I have some suggestions today for a story progression, how to, in your first draft, to get that, I think, a smoother way of writing that first draft and getting your story told, and then going back and adding other things in. So I like to say that first, writing is hard. Don't think it's not hard. I'm not here to tell you that this is easier, that it's easy, because it's not. But hopefully this will a smoother, easier transition into getting that manuscript done by these tips I'm going to give you for the first draft, for writing your first draft. First, are you a plotter or are you a pantser? And I think that makes a big difference in getting how you approach your first draft. I am a pantser. I don't need to know but a couple things to get started, and then I just go. I always say I wind my characters up and I set them down in a scene and I see what happens. Even if you're a plotter and you need to do an outline, no matter how extensive that outline is, I've heard people say they do a 40-page outline before they get started. And if that's the way you do things, that's the way you do things. It's okay. Don't try to change because someone else is doing something different and it worked for them, because you have to do what works for you. So if it is a 40-page outline or a 20-page outline, or no outline at all, as the pantser, that all those things are okay. But you will need different things to set up to get ready for your first draft. Basically in your brain, I think, and to get started. But I think that once you get to that first draft, everyone can attack it the same way in the things that I'll lay out today. But as a plotter, you're going to build your outline before you get started. You might know a lot more that to include in that first draft than a pantser will know, because a pantser doesn't really know where their story is going, right? I'm a pantser, but I write cozy mysteries for the most part. I do have a woman's fiction book that's coming out, and it was a little harder for me because it's a different kind of plot and a different kind of story. But I know always that someone's going to die, right? I kill people in my book. So someone's going to get killed, and then the amateur sleuth is going to come along. They're going to try to follow the clues that lead to the capture of the killer. So even though I'm a pantser, I have an idea of where my book is going. So I'm sort of like the plotter in that instance. You know where the book is going. But I think that is very important to know where your book is going, and very important to realize if you're a pantser or a plotter, so that you can work within those confines and get your story done. So what you need to write a story. I think even for, as I said, a pantser or a plotter, there are certain things that you need. And it's just, if you're a pantser or a plotter, how you approach these things. But there are certain things that every writer needs in a story. First, you need a story. What are you going to write about, right? You need a story. Some people say, I've always wanted to write a book. And the first thing I say to them is, What is your book going to be about? Because you just can't have that lofty goal of writing a book. And I think those might be people who really haven't ever thought about being a writer. Most writers that I talk to tell me, oh, I knew forever I wanted to be a writer. When I was a kid, I used to go to the library and I thought I want to write books like that. Lots of people have taken that in college and gotten an MFA. So those kind of writers, I didn't start out that way. Those kind of writers always have a story in their head. They know the kind of story that they want to tell. So it may be easier for you to have that story. This is the story that I want to tell. Than the next person who says, I just want to write a book. I feel like I should write a book. So that part may be harder for them, for the story to get going. And that's why I included it. You need a story. You need to know what you're writing about, the genre that you're writing in. That can get hard. That can get messy. That can actually change as you write the story. You may think that you start out writing a suspense story and it ends up a romance story. Maybe it's romantic suspense. I don't know. But it has changed, during the time you write the story. So it's good to have an idea, general idea of the genre, but certainly know your story. For me, I write cozy mysteries. So as I said, I'm going to kill somebody. I'm going to write about murder. That's my story. I'm going to write about murder, and then I'm going to catch the killer. What is your story about? Do you know the story that you want to write? You cannot write a first draft or any draft if you don't know your story. Second, you need to do research. Research in a story is so important. Yes. We always have heard the adage, I guess Mark Twain said it, write what you know. And that's good, but it limits you, right? It limits your imagination. It limits your story. So I'm not saying don't write what you know, just know what you write. And in order to know what you write, you have to research it. So it's important before you get started on a story, and it's important a part of your first draft is the research. Now, you might not be writing a sci-fi or something that calls for a lot of technical writing, and you need to look up to see what's the diameter of Mars because you're going to have a spaceship going there or something. That's not necessarily the kind of research you do. I do research on backgrounds for my characters. If I wanted my character to work in textiles, she works on a loom. I need to find out about looms. I need to find out about textile workers. I need to find out what instruments or equipment she would need to be able to do that. That's research. Maybe my character has a background. She has Polish grandparents or something, and I need to find out traditions. She's going to visit her grandparents or traditions that she's carried forward in her life. I need to find out what those kind of traditions are. So research isn't necessarily a technical thing, and I'm sure you guys know this, but just to say as part of my presentation, you always need to do research. I research names. Sometimes I want my characters to have a Southern name. I want them to have an Italian last name. I do research on those things as well. So before you get started, do enough research that you can write your story. If your character has a certain background or a certain occupation, do enough research to do that. If your character is diverse, you decided I'm going to put diverse characters in my story, do research on that culture or, on that ethnicity or that sexual orientation before you get started on your first draft. Don't try to do those things, and we'll talk about this in a little while you're writing. So these are things that you need to write the story. You need to have them ahead of time. You need characters. As I said, doing a character, coming up with characters, you probably could have a whole semester in an MFA program. I don't know. I didn't take one, but about characters, making them authentic, making them believable. So we're not going to talk about today how to make characters, but you need those things. To write your first draft, you don't necessarily have to have them all fleshed out, because they will evolve. You do, even as much as a personality, they will evolve. You should have in your head, I want this guy to be the bully, the bad guy, the villain, whatever. I want this person, my protagonist, to be meek and mild, or I want them to be courageous, or I want them to be, very pretty and or handsome and, charming. You should have that in your head, and probably their background information. But on a first draft, you don't have to have so much of that, because it will change as you do other drafts. Your characters, their reaction to things will probably change, because you will put them, your situations. We'll talk about how we're going to build from our first draft. The situations that they will find themselves in as you build on that first draft may change how they react and what they do. But you need to have your characters in place. You need to know how to write believable, authentic characters as well as dialogue. So you need those things in place. You need a plot. So that kind of goes hand in hand with your story, right? Although in a little bit, I'll tell you the difference in a story and a plot. You need a plot. If you don't have a plot, you don't have a story, right? Because that's what your book should be. It should have a plot where people are working toward that plot, and that plot has to be resolved at some point, and I'll show you a graph in a little bit about that. So you need a plot for your story before you start writing, before you sit down to write that first draft. And you're going to need a setting. The setting is very important. People sometimes don't realize setting can also be a character, right? If you have a book you're writing and there's a rainstorm, that becomes a part of your story. Your characters can't get somewhere because of the rainstorm or a snowstorm, or there's a hurricane coming. Though the setting, or like cozy mysteries that I write, they're always set in a cozy, quaint little village or town where everyone knows everyone, because you need the rumor mill in order to solve the mystery. Then your setting becomes a character. So it's important when you start out, is it going to be a dark, gloomy book and a lot of things will take place at night? Are you going to have a lot of it take a place out in the open? Is it mostly inside of a house? Those things you need to know, because it gives you the feel of the book, right? How the book will feel to others. Will they feel like they're on a deserted island, if that's your plan? Will they feel like they're in a snowstorm or a rainstorm? Can they hear the lightning? Can they hear the thunder? See the lightning, hear the thunder. So you have to know that before you start writing your first draft. Not to say that you have to put those things in, but it will affect the way you write your story. Even on your first draft, it will affect the mood of the story. So these are the things that you need to start your story, to start your first draft. A story, you need to do research. You need to have your characters in mind. You need to have a plot, and you need to have a setting. Remember, if you have any questions as we go along, I have some help here. Madeline's here to help me. And just yell out the question. Write it down in the chat and she'll yell it out for me. So what's your story? I put this in because I didn't know that I wasn't going to be able to see anyone and interact. And I like to go around the room and ask people, what are you writing about? So that I can kind of gear the things that I say toward the problems that they're having, or the questions that they're asking. But this is also part of our things that I said you need. You need a story. So in order to come up with your story, this is what I think is the best way to approach this. This will help you keep your book going in the right direction. It will help you to keep your story engaging and entertaining to the readers. And because it moves your story forward, it gives you something to aim at You know, when you're writing a story, you have to aim for something. You know, the end of your book, you have to aim for that. The climax of your book, you have to aim for that. Everything you write should be working toward that goal, whatever that is. And in this case, I call it a story question. And you may have heard this before. But the question in the story represents the goal of the plot. What is the plot about? So in my book, in my Cozy Mysteries, the goal is, will the amateur sleuth, this is the story question, will the amateur sleuth catch the killer? And so in the entire time I am writing, I should be writing toward to get to the answer to that question. Yes or no. Will she do that? So I have to write everything that moves my story toward the answer to that question. And if you do that in your first draft, if you figure out what your story question is, and I've got a page with some story questions, you figure out what your story question is, it will help you in that first draft not to wander. I know sometimes people write first drafts and they'll tell me, my first draft is 120,000 words. It's not necessarily a bad thing, you know, even if you're writing a mystery or romance or a thriller or something that should be between 80 and 90,000 words. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but a lot of that is fluff. And do you necessarily have to have fluff in your story when you're writing the first draft? No, because I think the first draft should be the bones of the story. We'll talk about that in a minute too. So you won't end up with 120,000 words. You should end up with less words. And then as you fill in, because we're going to talk about building your story with layers, but as you go back for your second draft and third draft and however many drafts you need, you're going to add words. So it's better for the first draft not to be a lot of fluff. And it should be, I think, this is my opinion, it should be tighter because it should answer your story question. You should decide what your story question is, and your book should answer it. It should go scene by scene. We'll talk about this to get to that conclusion. So the question in the story represents the goal of the plot. It drives the characters to act as they do. The characters, whatever characters you pick out, are moving toward, in your narrative arc, toward the conclusion, toward the answer to your story question, and they are driving the story that way. It helps you stay on track. There are story goals and scene goals. It's what gets you to the next scene or to the resolution of your book. So like the story question where I gave you the story question of my entire book with the amateur sleuth, catch the killer. Then each scene can also have a question. And if you write your first draft in scenes, which we'll talk about in a little bit, you should be able to get through your story, through your first draft with the goal of answering all your story questions and keeping your story on track, because that's very, very important, and in short and fewer words. The story question will lay out the path ahead, and whatever you write for the entire story should follow it. So it lays out the path that you should go. The answer will lie at the end of the book, right? You ask the story at the beginning. You have an overall story, question. You start the answer at the beginning, and then the answer is finished at the end. Will the amateur sleuth catch the killer? So in my book, that has to start out with a murder in order for them to have a killer to catch. And it moves from scene to that end. Use the story question as an aid to stay on track. If any portion of your work in progress is not directly or indirectly tied to the story question through the plot, a character's background, or a situation in the setting, it probably does not belong in the story. So initially, that's what you want to do. That's how you keep your first draft tight. That's how you get it not to be 120,000 words. Although if that's the way you work, I don't knock anybody the way they work. But if you think about it, your first draft should be the bare bones of your story, and you build from there instead of cutting back from there. Some people say, oh, I just write everything that I want or I think that's in a story. that's the way you work, that's okay too. But I think it's better to add to the story than to take away, because don't you love all the things that you write? Doesn't it hurt you? I know it does me to have to take things out of my story. Aren't you always saying, oh, that was such a good paragraph and I didn't want to have to take that out? Wouldn't it be better to start out with just the bare bones, nothing that you love so much, but something that tells the story, and then you add all the good stuff? And you know where you are, where you stand with word count, with story progression, and you don't have to worry so much about cutting out as you do as putting in. This, of course, I say is my way of doing things, and that's what I'm showing you today, to how to write a first draft that I think will be helpful and beneficial in getting that story done quickly and without losing a lot of time and effort, and especially your hard work, because it doesn't fit into the story. In a scene, the question is asked and answered with each scene, and the scene may end in a question as well. And the same is true for the story question, although it shouldn't end in a question. I should have made that clear, because that's a cliffhanger, and you don't want cliffhangers for the end of your story. Story question examples. In a mystery, who killed Jane Doe? Thriller, who is trying to kill Jane Doe, or why is that guy trying to kill Jane Doe? Romance, can Jane Doe overcome her emotional baggage and find love? So here, in every category, quest, can Jane Doe locate the stone of life and save the world? Every YA, here's a YA for us. Can Jane Doe pursue her musical talents despite her family's disapproval? So these are your story questions. Come up with a story question when you get ready to sit down and you've determined this is what my story is going to be about. Ask yourself the story question, write it down in your notebook or in your outline or whatever you have, so that you can keep in mind that you're working toward an answer to this question. Here is my question, reader, for when they get your book. Here is my question, and this is how I'm answering this question. The way you answer it is through your story, right? So come up with a story question when you sit down to write your draft, and then try to stick with answering that question. I've lost my mouse here. Writing your first draft. So that was the preliminary stuff, the stuff that I think that if you write your first draft, it can help you to be to get the bare bones of your story together. And then you can expand from there. So you'd want to do your initial research. This is for your writing your first draft. Do your initial research, know your ending, let your ideas flow, build your book in layers, and include plots and scenes. So doing your research, I talked about this a little bit earlier, that you have to research your book, know what you're doing before you start writing. Because if you don't do research in the beginning, it will be too many places, although it's okay to do this. There'll be too many places in your book that you're going to have to stop to either do research, which I don't suggest you do on the first draft, or you're going to have to put there, look up this later. You're going to have a lot of stuff to look up later, which is going to take more time. The way you do research, I'm sure you have your own way, but ask the internet. I Google everything. I ask Google everything. But be leery. Just because it's on a wiki page, that's a great place to start, because Wikipedia is my favorite thing. But make sure that you're getting the right information. I just recently got a contract to write a women's fiction book, and someone gave me the idea for it. They sent it to me. I did all kind of research, and I found the story that they told me on the internet, and I found, how horrific it was and what the reaction that people had, but I couldn't find a Wikipedia page for it. So I kept looking. In the end, long story short, in the end, I found out that story wasn't true. That it's a myth of a sort, and I had to get the correct information. So ask the internet, make sure that your information is correct. Don't research everything. Sometimes I know a writer that whatever she researches and finds out about a subject, she puts all that information in her book. And not necessarily in an informational dump sort of way. She kinds of put it in a conversation, but you can tell it's because she's researched and she knows she found out all this stuff and she wants everyone else to know what she finds out. So don't research everything or put everything into your story that you found. Sometimes you use it just to make your, to make your writing easier, to make your character more knowledgeable. But that knowledge doesn't have to show up on the page as knowledge. It can show in the way that she acts or the things that she says or he says. Don't get distracted. By that, I mean, on the internet, there's social media, IG. Don't start, tweeting and reading tweets and scrolling through IG and liking this and liking that, or getting on Facebook. When you get on the internet to do your research, do your research. Don't get distracted. Read other books. When I wanted to write women's fiction, because I was always writing mysteries, I read a lot of women's fiction books. This will help you on your first draft because you'll know how the story goes, how those kinds of stories go. For instance, if it's your first time writing a romance, or if it's your first book, period, reading other people's books and other works will help you know how books are written in certain genres, because every genre, every story has a pattern to it. If it's romance, girl meets boy, they fall in love, they fall out, and then they get back together. If it's a mystery, someone dies, something is stolen, and it has to be found, right? If it's suspense, something is going to happen and the characters have to stop that. Every story has a pattern, and it's okay. You just make your story, what's inside of that pattern, different, and so that people are interested in. So read other books in that genre, read other books just to learn how to write. And then talk to experts. If you're writing about DNA, talk to someone that knows about DNA. If I wrote a book and the person died from succinylcholine, I had to find out about that. So I asked a doctor, and I also asked her about information on how it could be taken from a hospital. What are the procedures for locking up medicine, narcotics? And so I got my information from an expert, and that's what I put into the book, the idea of it, not necessarily that information. So do your research before you get started. And then I think this is so important. Know your ending. Don't start writing that first draft if you don't know how it's going to end, because you will write aimlessly, and so this goes hand in hand with asking your story question. If you have a story question, it's will the amateur sleuth catch the killer? That's the question you need to answer. What happens at the end? Because the answer could be yes, the answer could be no. Maybe your character dies at the end because the killer kills them, and then the story goes on about the serial killer. I don't know. But if you don't know the ending, you won't be able to get there. So in your first draft, it's so important to know the ending. Some people say if they're writing murder mysteries, I don't know who the murderer is until I start writing. That's okay. As long as you know what happens in the end. Are they going to catch the killer in the end? And who's going to catch the killer in the end? If it's a love story, is it going to be a happily ever after? Which it should be, because that's one of the formulas that goes with romance, a happy ending, happily ever after. But whatever it is, know your ending. I always tell people, don't start your story if you don't know your ending, because I'll say it again. You will amble along the way and just keep going because you don't have a goal to get to. You don't have a point, a destination to get to. Know your ending. The end. Be sure that you're able to write that at the end. Then build your book in layers. So this is what I was talking about for your first draft. So we know that you need, some people have explained some first draft to me as like peeling back an onion. I don't like onions. So I don't use that because I can smell it and see it when I'm talking like that. But I think of it like a house. I am an HGTV fanatic. I love HGTV. So I've watched all these shows. Building your book should sort of be like building a house, right? And the first layer of your house, the frame of work of the house, I'm going to liken that to your first draft. That's what you're doing in your first draft. You are just putting up the rafters, putting up the frame to your book. So when you sit down to write, you know your story, you know what's supposed to happen in the story, you know your characters, you have your question. So now you're going to sit down and write your book, write the framework of the book. You're going to put in all the scenes that need to go to get, you know, to the answer of the book and to get to the end of the book. We'll talk about scenes in a minute. That's what your first draft should be. Yes, you should let your ideas, you know, flow, what you have, and the idea for the story. But it shouldn't just be anything. You shouldn't go out on a tangent, writing, you know, stories, pages and pages of things that'll never go into the book. That's just me. I don't see the reason for that. Maybe it's because sometimes writers feel like they need to flesh out characters, flesh out their story. And that's okay to do that. But after you've written the bones of the story, right? After you've put the framework of the story together, which is the first draft. And then you can add all the paint and the wiring and the pretty fixtures and finishes like the chandeliers. You can put the plumbing in, you can add the electricity, you can paint, you can, you know, put all the fluff in after you've built the frame to your book. The first draft is the framework of your book. It is the story of your book. And then you can put your personality, your setting, your descriptions in. You can polish your story. You're going to put it in layers. So I've heard people say, you know, my first draft, I do this. And then all the other drafts, my next draft, I add character descriptions. Or the next draft, I put my setting in. Maybe by the fourth draft, you're setting more of your mood or your tone. Although I think that's important to know that with your first draft, so that, you know, you can kind of write like that. You put in all your fancy words, big words, all the things that readers will remember that one day, you know, they will quote you on from your book. That's what I mean by layering your story. The first draft is your first layer. It's the bare bones, it's the framework. And then each time you know, the next thing in a house that they do after they do the frame, they put the outside on it, but they have to do the plumbing and they have to do the wiring before they can even put up walls. So that's what you do. You do your frame, and then you put in the plumbing and you put in the wiring. Then after that, you can put up the walls and you can paint and you can put in your nice fixtures. So maybe that works out to 4 or 5 drafts for you. Maybe you're able to incorporate all those things into the second draft or the third draft. I've heard people say they do 10 drafts because each time they've added something more. They've added dialogue. I've heard people say that too, that they don't really put dialogue into their first draft. And that's a draft down the road. And all those things are okay. And I think a dialogue for me is important, and that's one of the first things I put, but maybe that's not how you layer it. I just want you to understand that everything doesn't have to go into the first draft. You can put those things in as you go, as you do your subsequent drafts. So, and again, that's the way you keep it succinct and you get through your story. It's hard when you try to do all those things. I am a person that writes. I try to put everything in on the first draft. So sometimes you get stuck because you don't know where the story's going. And not that you don't know the story's going. You don't know how you want to express that story. You may have it in your head, but how do you get it down on paper, right? So if you're writing a second draft or a third draft, you won't get stuck because you just put in a note to do this later, add this scene later, add this conversation later, because that way you have time to think about it and you just move on to the next one, to the next part that you're writing. So plots and scenes. Plots and scenes are so important in a book. And I think that they should be put into the first draft, but probably not in such great detail as it will be in the end of your book. But I don't think that you can follow through from beginning to end without knowing your plot, not knowing how your scenes will move along that plot for your story, how it moves the story forward. So the plot is a series of scenes deliberately arranged by cause and effect that create dramatic action filled with conflict. It's a series of scenes deliberately arranged by cause and effect that create dramatic action, and it's filled with conflict. That's what your plot is about. It's where the readers learn about the characters in your story, and it answers the overall question of your story. So in your first draft, you need to have an idea of what your plot is, right? And to do that, you have to take a series of scenes, and you arrange those a certain way. And you can even add the real tension and things later. That can be another level, another layer, or another draft rather, in your story. But putting your plot in is important, even if you put it in not in detail, but just so it's there. The difference in a story and a plot. So you want to write your story, but you want to put your plot in. The story is a series of events told in chronological order. And you may say, well, so Abby, that's sort of what you're saying for this first draft, that I just want to write, a series of events in chronological order. Yeah, you do want to do that, but you want to include the plot. The plot is the sum of the series of events. And it's not necessarily told in order. The plot isn't, because sometimes how you have flashbacks, or you talk about what happened yesterday, or scenes have to do with things that happened yesterday. It's what makes the story dramatic, thematic, and have an emotional significance. So that's what I mean about you're adding the plot, but you don't have to add it in so much detail. You don't have to put the drama and the emotional significance in on your first draft, but you have to have that narrative arc, which is part of the plot. And I'll talk about that. You still want to keep the narrative arc in the first, you include the narrative arc in the first draft of your story. For example, a story is the king died, then the queen died. So you told a story. That's what happened. But the plot, the king died after suffering a long illness, and then the queen died from grief, right? So that shows drama, that shows an emotional significance, and it has a theme to it. She suffered, he suffered, then she suffered, and she died. So that's the little tweak that you want to add to the plot. Even though in the beginning, in the first draft, you just want to tell your story, just get your story on paper, then that's how I think that you should tweak it, is by adding some of the plot, showing some of the significance of what's in the story. So this is how the story goes. I'm sure you guys have all seen this. It's like a roller coaster. Then this is a narrative arc. In the beginning, you just tell a little bit about the story, and then your story begins with the conflict. Although there are some people say that every line and every page should have conflict in it. And that goes to the rising action. You reach a climax, and you have a falling action and the resolution. So this is what you want to follow in your story. You want to start out saying about your characters, even if you're not describing them. They should have a name. When you get started, they should have a name. But even if you're not describing them or describing what they're wearing, because you can save that to a later draft, you want to include your characters and start with the conflict of the story. What if this person is on a quest? What kind of things are they going to run into to build conflict? Are they going to have to, in order to get to the city of gold, are they going to have to cross the jungle and swim through a river of crocodiles? I don't know if crocodiles go on rivers, but I think they do. Climb a mountain or go take a 30-day journey around it, and they only have 15 days to claim the city of gold. What obstacles or conflict are you going to put in their way for whatever type of story you have? That's how you get to your climax. And those are the things that you want to put in the story. You may not say what the crocodiles looked like, or how many they were, or how wide the river, or how high the mountains are in your first draft. You just write, and there were mountains, and they had to climb over the mountains because they were unable to climb around it. Certainly, you can add more if your brain, is saying, oh, I see this scene. I'm going to go ahead and write this scene out. Don't hold back from that. If you can describe it, certainly you could put in your first draft. But in order to get it out and get it on the paper and not be stuck, which a lot of people run into, if you get it down on paper, when you go back to read it, you're going to visualize it anyway, and you'll be able to write those descriptions when you go back for your second draft, whatever you decide your second draft is. Maybe your second draft is, I'm putting everything else I need in there. I've got the story down on paper with the plot and the scenes. Now I'm going to put all my descriptions and character traits and, theme, everything into the second one. Or you may be one of those people with the layers, more layers, 5 or 6 layers. Well, this time around, I'm going to put the dialogue in. This time around, I'm going to put the description in. But I just don't do that on your first draft if you're, especially if you're having trouble getting that story onto paper. So what are scenes? So I've been talking about scenes all the way from the beginning. Scenes are what will drive that plot, right? They're not random. They have cause and effect. They ask questions and they answer questions. Just like the overall story question. Remember, I said that each scene has questions. And that's how you move your story along, I think, in your first draft. You put in scenes. So remember our narrative arc that I just talked about. This is the way you move through the story. So what do? You add a scene for each part of your narrative arc. A scene for when you're introducing your characters at the beginning of the book, or you introduce the hook of the story. Then as the tension and conflict rises, you add each scene. So one scene might be that, so say in the beginning, if we're talking about the quest, the hero or heroine, whichever one, learns of their quest. That's the beginning. That's the hook. That's what's going to get everyone reading your book, is because, oh, are they going to make it? Do they have to go and do this? And your question for your story is, whatever the quest one was, will they reach the city of gold in time to whatever they need to do? That's your question. And so your first scene is your hook. You get it all together. Then each scene is them getting to the end of the story, which the ending because you didn't start writing until you got your ending together. And it helps to move the story forward to answer your story question. So that first scene might be, I don't know what I said at first. They had to cross a jungle or whatever it was. Then they had to swim a river of alligators and climb that mountain. So each scene that you put in your first draft tells the way that you are moving toward the end of your story or to the answer of your question. If you write your book in scenes, I think it'll be easier to get that story done and move along in your first draft, right? Of putting your story on paper. So you just continue to write in scenes, you get into a climax, and then the falling action, and of course the resolution. If you write your book, your first draft in a scene, and these scenes can be individual scenes. They could just tell each story or each scene, which has a cause and effect. They're not random. One builds on the next. You don't even have to put the transition between them. I do this often. I will write a scene, and then I go and I write the other scene. And then later I say, okay, now I have to bring these two scenes together. How did I get from this scene to that scene? Because in the beginning, I don't have to have them together. I just know that this scene has to be in the book and this scene has to be in the book. And now I have to have a transition. I have to bridge them. I tell people all the time, I need to bridge these two things that happen. I need to put something in between them to make them go. It might be writing another scene that puts them together. It might be just some words at the beginning of one chapter or at the end of the other chapter. But that's the good part about writing your first draft. You don't have to put these scenes together. You just write your scenes that you know you need to answer your question and to get to the end of the book. So, and let your ideas flow, right? Good luck with that second sentence because it's hard to get the first sentence is hard to get. So good luck with your second sentence. But you won't have that problem if you're writing scenes because you can write them out of order. You don't have to put them in the order that they're going to go in the story. Here, I do this all the time. This is a book that I'm writing right now. My first chapter is always chapter 1, but every other chapter is chapter next because I don't know where it's going. I don't get stuck because if I can't write one part, I skip to another scene. And then later I bridge those scenes. There has been times when I write something and then I think, oh, I need to write this too. This is another scene I have in my head. And it was 4 or 5 chapters that bridged those chapters together because that thought was further down the road in my story than where I was. So I don't have to write it in order. And later I can just bridge the scenes together. But I know that I need those scenes to get to the end of my book. So while you're writing, do that chapter next. And that way you can write chapters out of order and rearrange them later. Or you can also type in, add something here. Sometimes I'll write, and she was wearing, and I go, I don't know what she was wearing. But I'm not going to get stuck and not be able to write. I'll type in all caps or maybe highlight it. Put what she was wearing here. Because in a little while, it'll pop in my head. If you try to do it all together, all at once, some people I know, they write from the beginning to the end. They don't break it up. But I think on your first draft, that's okay to do. Put down all the things you know that's going to get you to the climax and get you to the end of your story. So write out of order. You can put your personality descriptions and polish in later. Just get the story on the page. Don't take the time to do extra, I don't know what that says down there because it's in my way, extra research. Don't take the time then. After you've done your initial research, if you don't have anything else, you feel like you have enough to get started and then you start to write and you really do need to find something, research how elephants walk. If you decide that someone is walking behind an elephant, write that in all caps and say, I'm going to come back and do that later because you can do that in another draft, in your next draft. How long does it take to write a book and to do, to get this draft together? Yeah, don't worry about that. It shouldn't take you 7 years or 5 years, but some people take longer than others. I write a book in 3 weeks. I have a friend who takes a year to write a book. The book is finished, either way. So, but my caveat here, I think that if you follow this pattern in writing your first draft, you're going to get that draft written pretty quickly because you're not going to worry about what she had on or the dialogue. You don't have to worry about that. You don't have to worry about the transition from one scene to the next. You're writing your scenes. And I bet once you get all those things together, they're going to come together pretty quickly in your head. You're going to know what needs to happen because it's going to follow the scenes that you've put down in your first book. So build your draft, your first draft, build it like you do a house. Put in the framework and then add all the finishing touches in subsequent drafts. So are there any questions? I have to find where you are there. Any questions? Did anyone write anything in the chat? I don't see anything. We're nearly out of time. I thought I'd have more time to answer questions, but it looks like maybe. Do we have any questions?
I can't see any questions. No.
Okay. All right. Good. Okay. All right. Certainly, if you have any questions for me, follow me, Abby L. Vandiver. I'm on Instagram and Twitter and Facebook. Say hello. Even if you don't have questions, follow me. I'll follow you back.
Yeah, thank you so much for doing this masterclass.
Okay. Thank you for having me.
Right. Yeah, I especially liked the slide that you had about the story questions with a different genre and how it is a different question, different angle of looking at things. So I really like that. I took a screenshot of that to save it to my laptop.
Same thing with your scenes. You can ask a scene question. What is my goal in this scene to get to what point? And that way you know when to finish your scene too. So okay. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Bye now.